Hi, and welcome to this quick guide to Puritanism that I'm producing for you all. You'll have to pardon my voice. I'm still getting over laryngitis, so I'm a little hard to understand. I'm going to keep this brief for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is my voice. And you may hear me clear my throat or cough a bit. You'll have to excuse me, I hope. But I want to give just a little bit of an overview of what you're going to be reading for the term and give you a little bit of historical background, a little bit of philosophical, theological, sociological background so that you can sort of contextualize things and get off to the right start. A lot of the stuff that we're going to be reading 400 years old, it's quite a bit of a stretch for some folks. It's not just the language barrier, but it's also sort of the way these folks approach reality and approach different things that we sort of maybe look at differently today, in some cases radically differently. Let's start off with some myths and misconceptions. I did a presentation at the Denton Public Library on this once, and it was, I think, very well received. People thought it was pretty interesting. We have some unusual myths and misconceptions about Puritans, Pilgrims, that sort of thing. First one would be Puritans and Pilgrims aren't the same thing. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but they're not the same thing. And a lot of people conflate the two, but it's not exactly. They're very similar, but not exactly the same thing. Second thing is, look at the fellow down on the right there. That's the typical way that we present pilgrims when we are talking about them to our students or our kids. You see this, the little hand turkeys that people make, kids make at Thanksgiving time, with the big giant blunderbuss musket there with the funny flared end, the hats with buckles, the shoes with buckles, the belts with buckles, the buckles with buckles, just buckle, 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 and then black, black and white. That's all that they wore. Most Puritans and almost all Pilgrims didn't wear anything like that. We'll talk about why in a moment. The other myth that persists is that they didn't smoke or drink. They certainly did both. They actually thought it was kind of unhealthy if you didn't have some alcohol. Part of that was because water wasn't very easily purified, but there was an idea that alcohol, in moderation, made the blood strong. They weren't particularly fond of smoking, but they didn't think it was a sin. They just thought it was kind of a nasty habit. The other myth is that Puritans thought that sex was bad. Quite the contrary. They felt that healthy sex life was very important. So much so that if you were a newly married Puritan couple and you hadn't had a child in a year or two, you might expect a visit from a church elder or two to say, did you not read the book? Why aren't we having children here? Children were very important. They were an important byproduct of marriage, so there's only one way back then to be able to have them. And so Puritans had nothing against sex in marriage. Outside of marriage, big change. Okay, big difference. That is that absolutely not acceptable to them. So anything that would be premarital sex, anything that would be adultery, anything that would be homosexuality, anything that would be outside of what would be considered very orthodox, mainstream, traditional, historical, marital sex, one man, one woman sort of thing within the context of marriage was all that they approved of. But within the context of marriage, they certainly approved of. Well, now, how do we get all these myths and misconceptions? Basically, you got the Victorians to blame for this. And you could do a whole class on Victorians' views of Puritanism if you want to. There are tons of books about them. But essentially, people like Hawthorne, I'm afraid. The fact of the matter is that the Puritans didn't actually have any of these hang-ups. They were quite open. In fact, they weren't the least bit embarrassed about talking about sexuality at all. Many sermons exist. Hey, you're going to read William Bradford's A Plymouth Plantation. He even talks in a chapter there about bestiality, for heaven's sakes. So they weren't the least bit squeamish about it. It's the Victorians who were squeamish about it. The Victorians were the ones who said, sex is really disgusting, we don't want to talk about it. The Victorians were the ones who sort of spiritualized marriage. You can get into a Victorian lit class and see that, the poetry, the fiction, etc. They turned their spouses into angels and marriages into something that was highly spiritualized. The Puritans actually rarely got married in churches. They saw marriage as largely a civil contract, and like other civil contracts, it should be honored, and not to honor it is a sin. It was a special type of civil contract, or covenant, if you want to call it a covenant, because it had rules that were prescribed in the Bible, but they didn't see it as a religious ceremony. Marriage is a religious ceremony. They didn't see it that way. They saw it as kind of a business or contractual thing. Well, it's the Victorians who did this, because the Victorians, during the period of the temperance movement, during a period where sexuality was really not something that people spoke of, they had a lot of hang-ups about it, they went and looked backward and projected back on their supposed ancestors and said, well, if we're conservative about sex and we don't think alcohol's a good thing and we think you should dress modestly, you've got to imagine that great-great-grandpa must have really been, right? Well, that wasn't necessarily the case. And particularly since they were motivated by religion, the Victorians simply said, you know, we just assume that they're incredibly hyper conservative about these things. They were conservative by today's standards, but not in the way the Victorians kind of reinvented their ancestors, if you want to be. In terms of their outfits, they never wore anything like this. Remember, the Puritans were contemporaries of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. Jonson wrote plays making fun of them, mostly for being hypocrites and stuff like that. Well, he just didn't like Puritans. Most of them weren't hypocrites at all, but it was fashionable to make fun of them in that day. But they wore the same sorts of outfits that other Renaissance people wore. They wore quite interesting, colorful outfits. They didn't wear all that. Why the buckles? Well, the Victorians thought buckles were old-timey and old-fashioned looking. So they made them up with lots and lots of buckles. But the buckle didn't really come along as a device for accoutrements and as an accessory on outfits until after the Puritans, frankly. The Puritans would have known almost nothing about buckles. They would have used buttons. So in a way, it would be like saying, what were the Victorians like? I know. Let's dress them up like flappers, because flappers are old-timey. Yeah, that's the ticket. But the Victorians didn't look at all like flappers. Not at all, okay? So there you get a little bit of that background. Pardon me again for my voice. Some of the origins of Puritanism, which you need to know about, is not to do an entire history of Western Christianity, but of course in the Western world there were two major branches of Christianity up until the Protestant Reformation. In the West, it was the Roman Catholic Church. In the East, it was the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. And you had the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and all those different kinds of branches. But it was Orthodox and Catholicism. And it split basically because the Roman Empire split into East and West, right? So you can go back and do a wonderful world history lesson on that if you'd like to. But, of course, beginning in the 1530s, with our friend over there, Henry VIII. Most of you know that he is the reason why the English split from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he wasn't the first Protestant movement. It was the first national Protestant movement. You've got Martin Luther, you've got John Calvin, you've got others in, Central and Northern Europe who are splitting away from the Roman Catholic Church in terms of their belief. But what distinguishes Henry VIII's movement is he decides, I'm going to take my entire country in this direction, and I'm going to change the way the entire church is. I'm going to even change the name of the church. He calls it Anglicanism, or the Church of England, and the Roman Catholic Church is highly hierarchical. It's got a pope, it's got cardinals, it's got bishops, and so on and so forth, all the way down to the parish priest. Henry would keep that hierarchy, except he would take the role of the head of the church and split it into two. For religious questions, it was the Archbishop of Canterbury. But for property questions and other sorts of things, the King or Queen of England is the head, the manager, the CEO, if you will, of the C of E. That meant that in one fell swoop, he took over massive amounts of property and wealth that belonged to the Catholic Church, but that was located in his country. He just basically nationalized all of the convents, all of the abbeys, all of the church properties. And by the way, the Catholic Church at the time, was the greatest landholder in all of England. Because when people died, they would leave land or they would leave property to the church, and hoping that would kind of like buy them a little special dispensation. And over the centuries, it built up to a massive source of wealth for the church. Henry took it all. And of course, he did this over the question of divorce, but that's a little bit overplayed because he was already having sort of Protestant tendencies to begin with. It wasn't just the divorce issue. That's a lot of property, and that's hard to say no to. And by the way, I happen to have been reading this Martin Luther guy and this John Calvin guy, and they're making more and more sense every day. Well, to move on to the next point, Within Anglicanism, then, the Church of England splits away from the Roman Catholic Church, and for the most part, except for the management and the ownership of the property, and except for some theological beliefs that changed and were more in line with Protestantism, so for example, the idea of the priesthood of all believers, and these kinds of things, essentially it becomes Protestant in name and in a few theological tenets. But for the most part, if in the 1530s and 1540s, if you walked into an Anglican church, you wouldn't notice much difference between an Anglican church and a Catholic church. The hymns would be different because, of course, they created nationalistic hymns, right? Hymns about God and England, right, to promote patriotism. But, you know, all of the vestments and the candles and the crucifixes and the decorations would almost all be the same. Well, this didn't make some people very happy. There were some people who were part of this pro-Anglican, pro-Church of England movement, backed the king very staunchly, but they didn't do it for national reasons, and they didn't do it for Henry's divorce. They did it because they really were dyed-in-the-wool Protestants, and they felt that the Church of England was a great first step, but it needed to be purified. Because one of the things that Henry did, and you might do this too if you want to start a new club, how difficult do you make membership? Not very. So Henry basically, when he created the Church of England, said, who are the members? Everybody living in England. You're all members. Congratulations. No, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to fill out a card. You don't even need to come to church. You're just all members, automatically. Overnight, you're a member, right? So, you know, a murderer, a rapist, a burglar is in prison somewhere and says, well, what do you know? I'm a Church of England member. This didn't sit well with the purists, okay? The people who said, no, we need to break away from the Catholic Church, and we need to change everything about the way they've been running things. A few changes in theology, not enough. We need to change the whole thing. And what they really wanted to do is they wanted to purify the church. They wanted to purify its practices, its membership, everything about it. And they wanted to break away from Catholicism, not just in name only, but in all different things. So it was fine that the Church of England said priests can now marry. But the idea with them that anybody could just wake up and by virtue of being born in England be a member was outrageous. You should have to go through education. You should have to go through a profession of faith. You should have to do something formal. You should have to ask to be a member of the church. And you need to be sincere about it. They were rather offended that some guy who knew nothing about religion was lumped into the same group that they were, people who took it seriously. Now, the Puritans, of course, worked very hard as a very conservative faction to try to get the Church of England to purify itself and move even further in the direction of dyed-in-the-wool Protestantism, anti-Catholic. Okay, and they worked on this for a century, essentially, from about the 1630s to about the 1530s to the 1630s. Within that group, there was a group that called themselves separatists. These were people who said, you know what, we can't work within the Anglican Church, the Church of England, anymore. They're not going to change. They took the first step, but we're going to have to form a completely different church and break away from them. Because, you know, we appreciate the fact that Puritans want to work within the system to try to bring about a further Protestant Reformation within Anglicanism, but we think it's too corrupt, right? So they wanted to separate. Bottom line is, the Pilgrims, right, Mayflower, Plymouth Rock, all of that sort of stuff, Thanksgiving, Turkey, all that kind of stuff, they were separatists, not Puritans. Now, it just so happens that the Puritans actually won a civil war with Oliver Cromwell down there, as you can see, in the 1640s, and took over for a while, and they ran all of England as a sort of Puritan theocracy for a while. Once Cromwell died, the people in England decided, this kind of sucks. We really don't want to continue this. So they invite the old king back, and that's called the old king's son back, and that's called the Restoration. So they executed Charles, the king. But after they'd had enough of Cromwell, and Cromwell dies, they decide to write to his son, Charles II, and say, hey, we killed your dad and everything, and we ran sort of a theocratic, sort of religious dictatorship. We were tired of that. It just so happens we have a job opening called king. Would you like to come back? No hard feelings. We killed your dad, but no hard feelings. Believe it or not, the guy took the job. But then they didn't like him either, so that was another story. So they kept rotating through kings and queens until they found people they could live with. But that's a different story. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But before the Civil War, as tensions were mounting in the 1630s, the decade prior to the Civil War in England, the Civil War that the Puritans won,